You predicted this war, predicted the desalination plants being bombed by Trump. Let's just start with your predictions, right? Your YouTube channel is called Predictive History. You got a lot of this right. I'm not sure. So, how much time do you have today?
Well, I mean, we usually do 2 hours, so I was planning on 2 hours, but we can cut it short if you want.
No, no, no. As much as possible. This is okay. So, when do you think that is going to be a U.S./Israel ground invasion of Iran?
Right. So this is actually very hard to figure out because usually the strategy is to use proxies, right? So originally the strategy was to bribe the Kurds to go invade from Iraq. Another strategy was to deploy Sunni ISIS insurgents, which are heavily infiltrated by the CIA and the Mossad. And this was the strategy used very effectively in Syria. And then you would support these proxies with special forces and military intelligence targeting and airstrikes. The intention is to draw out the Iranian military as much as possible, right? Because the ground war favors the Americans and Israelis. There are certain issues with this, of course. The first issue is that the Kurds don't trust the Americans or the Israelis because they've been screwed so many times by them. So the most famous example is the 1991 Persian Gulf War, when George H.W. Bush encouraged the Kurds to rise up against Saddam Hussein. And they did. And then when it came time for the Americans to support the Kurds with air power, they didn't do so because they thought that a Kurdish state in part of Iraq would destabilize the region and would piss off the Turks, who are NATO allies. So then Saddam Hussein launched a brutal crackdown and killed hundreds of thousands of Kurds. I mean, it was a very brutal crackdown. And this is actually a very common theme in the Middle East. So the idea that the Kurds are going to go become cannon fodder for this Israel-American military operation didn't work out. And I think that, a couple of days ago, Trump announced that, no, they changed their mind. They're not going to use the Kurds. Another possibility is that Azerbaijan comes into the war, or maybe the Balakis in southeast Iran come into the war as well. But it doesn't seem as though anyone's interested because they appreciate that, first of all, you can't really trust the Israelis and the Americans. Second of all, it's a losing proposition because there's no grand strategy to actually win this war. So that's a major problem. Also, we need to understand that a lot of Mossad capability within Iran has been depleted. So remember, during the 12-day war, the Israelis, for the first few days, was devastating the Iranian government. A lot of scientists, a lot of generals, a lot of government officials were being killed, targeted. But the problem with that is that you are revealing to the Iranians your networks in the country. And so after the war, they were able to figure out, where the vulnerabilities were, where the leakages were, catch the spies, and eliminate this human intelligence network embedded in Tehran. And then you had the January protests where Mossad agents and Mossad affiliated cells were spearheading these protests. They were shooting police officers. They're actually beheading police officers. And this led to a violent confrontation. And, that made great headlines. And that made Trump very angry. He said that if these protests continue and the slaughter continues, then he would deploy his Air Force. But what it did was it destroyed these local networks that Mossad had spent years and years to build up in order to precipitate a color revolution. So in other words, another way of saying this is that after a year, the Israeli-American intelligence networks in Iran have been destroyed. And so it's very hard to launch a color revolution. And these conflicts have made the government in Iran, much more resolved, much more resilient, much more determined against the Americans and Israelis. So the idea of using proxies or using a color revolution playbook won't work in this scenario. So your only option is a ground invasion. And so now there's talk of the Americans seizing Karg Island off the Persian Gulf. which is where the Iranians refine the oil and export it overseas, primarily to China. And it sounds good because once you do that, then you basically destroy the economy of Iran. Iran is very much dependent on its oil exports. But the problem if you do that is that you're now within artillery range of the Iranians. So they don't even have to like launch drones or launch suicide submarines against you. They can just strike you with artillery embedded in the mountains. So from a military perspective, that would be suicidal. I mean, it would give the short-term adrenaline boost of like, yeah, we knocked out their economic capacity. But in the long term, it would be suicidal for the American military to do so. From a military perspective, there's no good pretext, no good strategy for a ground invasion. The problem is that given the way the war is going, given the sunk cost fallacy, given the fact that the GCC nations are under a lot of economic pressure, Trump may be pressured by his allies, and especially by Israel, to do something. And what the GCC nations need Trump to do is stabilize the Strait of Hormuz, to open the Strait of Hormuz. And that basically means a ground invasion where you have 100,000 American soldiers trying to occupy the Strait of Hormuz so that ships can pass through. Right now, there are two major issues. The first major issue is insurance. These commercial insurance companies refuse to insure any ships that pass through the Strait of Hormuz. So even if the Iranians don't actually fire anything or mine the Strait of Hormuz, these ships can actually pass through it. And the other issue is protection. So Trump has discussed the possibility of deploying the American Navy to chaperone these ships through the Strait of Hormuz. And that would be suicidal as well. So the Americans have found themselves in a situation where there are no good options. It's only a question of like, what is your worst option? And how much are you willing to further invest in a bad investment? It's literally a drunk gambler in a casino. It's really a question of like how much money he's going to lose before he actually gets kicked out of the casino.
So I saw the report from the Kurds. I'm not sure if this is true, that they rejected the invitation to fight against the Iranians, which you detailed in your lecture that this was going to be the strategy. They were going to try to arm the different ethnic groups because Iran is very ethnically diverse. There's only about 50% of the country are strictly Persian, but you have the Kurds in the northwest, you have the southeast region, you have, it is a very diverse country. So this has failed. And now the only way to really reclaim the Strait of Hormuz is with the ground invasion. You wrote in your Substack that in order to complete actual regime change, that you would need 500,000 soldiers, but you estimate to be successful, they would need 2 million.
Yeah, so experts are saying that Trump may deploy 500,000 troops, which is the bare minimum. And what I'm saying is that just to be, I mean, like militarily, you would need at least 2 million. Because remember, it's not just combat troops, it's also support as well. So you have to think about the logistics network that you need to protect. And that's the issue that they faced in the Iraq War in 2003. So, on the news, you saw these Americans doing thunder runs in Baghdad. It was good optics. But what was not reported was that the American military was moving so fast throughout Iraq that their logistics network got left behind. So their transport was left behind, and it was easy prey for the Fahedin, which is the armed militia of the Iraqis. So even though the main military suffered greatly under the American attack, it was actually the armed militia, okay? And these are just volunteers. They were doing tremendous damage to the American military logistics network. And so the Americans are good at shock and awe. They're good at air wars, a quick in and out. They're bad at fighting a long-term ground war. In fact, I mean, the Americans have not fought a long-term ground war since Vietnam, and that was